There are few deific powers in the realms that inspire the same degree of awe and fear as Bane, the Black Lord. If there were ever a god that could best be described as a mustache-twirling villain, then Bane would take the cake, as Bane, the god of tyranny, has always taken an active role in Faerun. For example, the nefarious organization, the Zhentarim, a very terrestrial organization, has historically been strongly associated with the god Bane and his clergy, and he could easily be seen as the most ambitious of gods, as he sees himself as the natural ruler and tyrant of all of existence. And it's clear from data mining that Bane, along with Myrkul and Baal, will feature prominently in Baldur's Gate 3. Additionally, you can choose to be a cleric of one of these gods. So, it would be more than useful to understand what role these deities have in the realms, starting with arguably the most important one among them, Bane. Bane is not one of the primordial deities birthed after Seluna's and Shar's first great conflict. Even as a human, Bane wanted nothing more than to become the most feared and respected tyrant the world had ever known. However, doing so would require an infusion of arcane power greater than that usually accorded to mortals. He found common cause with his newfound allies, Myrkul the Necromancer and Baal the Assassin. He was likely alive at some time concurrent with or after the fall of Netheril, and we know next to nothing about his mortal life. Bane forged a pact of mutual aid and ambition with his allies Myrkul and Baal. Together, they sought not just to conquer Faerun, but the plains themselves, striving for godhood itself. They realized in order to achieve divinity, they would have to face and defeat a divine being, claiming his power. Ultimately, they sought to target Jurgal, whom I have talked about in a previous video. But they also understood that they would need to achieve sufficient power to do so. To this end, they quested after artifacts of power in Faerun, and acted as generals of massive armies composed of humanoids of many races, culminating in the slaying of an ancient primordial, Maram of the Great Spear, an elder evil, and a being of power equivalent to that of a demigod, whereupon they divided the power of this being amongst themselves. Countless obstacles they faced, and each and every one they overcame, such that even Jurgal began to take note of them. And it is even rumored that Jurgal was secretly aiding them, unbeknownst to the trio, as Jurgal had already wearied of his position as god of death and tyranny. The Dark Three, as they had come to be known, eventually crossed the planar boundary into the Grey Waste, where Jurgal dwelt in his bone castle, defeating all of his minions, and then approached the god upon his throne of bone. Readying themselves for battle, they instead were surprised, as Jurgal told them he had grown weary of his power and station, and would willingly relinquish it to them, whereupon the three began to bicker and quarrel amongst themselves, as the illusion of friendship between them, spun in ambition, dissolved into nothingness, and a deadly fight ensued, each of them trying to determine who would rule from Jurgal's throne. Jurgal, indifferent to their wants, but not wanting to see them battle for eternity or die from exhaustion, resolved their dispute with a game of skill, when a failed game of skull bowling led nowhere, in part due to the intervention of the god Malar. Jurgal suggested leaving the decision up to chance. He proceeded to break off his skeletal finger bones, and the three dark travelers began to play a game of knuckle bones. Bane ultimately won, and took the portfolio of hatred, strife, and tyranny, believing that this would best facilitate his ability to rule over Faerun, and later the plains, stating the following: I choose to rule for all eternity as the ultimate tyrant. I can induce hatred and strife at my whim, and all will bow down before me while in my kingdom. During the ensuing centuries, Bane consolidated and cemented his power, quickly gaining a large following. Whereas Jurgal had enforced tyranny through death, Bane sought rulership and tyranny over the living. Unlike Jurgal, who had always been a more distant power, Bane took a much more active interest in the affairs of mortals and their politics, if only because it aided him in ensuring his dominance throughout the realms. For many centuries, Bane's power and influence waxed, but Bane, being what he was not merely content being the god of tyranny, strife, and hatred. He wanted more. In the year 1358 DR, and please note that Baldur's Gate 3 takes place in 1492 DR, Bane and Myrkul devised the greatest of their plots. They stole and hid the Tablets of Fate from Eu, the Overgod. Eu is a power far greater than any god, a power who can demote and promote any being to any level of divinity, and likely created realm space and all things in it. Eu had created the Tablets of Fate, which were powerful artifacts in the form of stone slabs that served to maintain the balance between the forces of law and chaos, and acted as a barrier between the worlds of Aber and Toril. Additionally, the tablets served the function of recording the names and purposes of every god and primordial in the sphere in order to remind them of their obligations. Bane and Merkel had erroneously believed that part of Eo's power lay in the tablets, but this was not true, as their purpose was largely symbolic, and his power was not tied to them. In response to this and the thieves' unwillingness to admit their culpability, Eo cast down all the gods from their planar realms, forcing them into Toril in mortal form, commanding the gods to return the Tablets of Fate to him. This cataclysmic event would come to be known as the Time of Troubles, and it was redefining for the Forgotten Realms. During this time, as all the gods had been cast down, Bane sought a way to regain his power. This eventually led to Bane besieging the city of Tantris in the form of a black armor-clad warrior in an effort to reclaim one of the Tablets of Fate he had ironically hidden in the Temple of Torim, the god of loyalty and duty. But Torim was informed of this, and he was met by Torim in battle, resulting in the mutual destruction of both gods. After what sometimes has come to be called the Avatar Crisis, Bane appeared dead, and his portfolio, along with those of Merkel and Baal, was given to Sirik, the Dark Sun, a mortal granted godhood for his wickedness, and the trio took on the namesake of the Dead Three, as none of them had survived the Time of Troubles. Some of Bane's former worshippers took to Sirik's faith, whilst others took to the faith of Bane's son, Iaktu-Xvim, a being Bane had likely sired with a demon. Much occurred over the next decade or so, and Iaktu-Xvim gained in power, drawing most of Bane's worshippers into his fold, until the year 1372 DR. For Bane, it soon would become apparent that death had been but a temporary setback. Anticipating the possibility of his own demise, Bane, the god of tyranny, had, like his companion Baal, created a scion for the purpose of his own regeneration. When the time was ripe, Xvim, his alleged son, turned out to be little more than a cocoon to contain the essence of Bane, and the god bursts forth into the black and armored figure that all know as Bane, destroying and consuming the younger god entirely. Bane quickly reconsolidated his church, re-established old alliances with gods, and drew his faithful back to him, and was soon where he had been prior to the Time of Troubles. Soon after this, the realms were to be befallen by yet another calamity, the Spell Plague, wherein Sirik and Shar murdered the goddess Mistra in the year 1385 DR, disrupting magic and collapsing the weave. But Bane, oddly enough, was largely unaffected. In fact, he seemed to have gained in power despite this. But then came the Second Sundering. The period between the Time of Troubles and Baldur's Gate 3 is known as the Era of Upheaval, where many strange and unpredictable things had come to pass. But beginning in the 1480s DR, the Forgotten Realms received a hard reset. The Second Sundering commenced with Eo's decision to recreate the Tablets of Fate and begin anew. Many deities thought dead returned. But oddly enough, and somewhat without explanation, Bane and his fellows, Merkel and Baal, were significantly reduced in power to the status of so-called quasi-deities, which are effectively little more than extremely powerful mortals. As Bane had been doing quite well up until the time of the Second Sundering, it is quite mysterious as to why he was reduced in power, from that of a greater god, the most powerful type of god, to that of a quasi-deity, although this makes much more sense for Merkel and Baal, as they had never fully returned as Bane had. It is at this juncture that Bane becomes relevant to us in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, which, as stated above, takes place around 1492 DR. We know that the Dead Three are directly involved in BG3. Lorien states as much. Quote, "As we desperately seek a cure, we discover the tadpole gives us godlike powers, and we find ourselves on the center stage of a complot hatched by none other than the Dead Three gods." End quote. Bane is, I would argue, the wiliest, most tenacious, and dangerous of the Dead Three, and has the track record to prove it. But how are he and his cohorts involved? For one, you can worship him, as well as the other members of the Dead Three, even though they are not gods, and only quasi-deities. And the most obvious and persistent theory, based on the little we do know from early access, is that the Absolute, the alleged one true god, is just a front for the Dead Three. In the scene where we interact with the Githyanki artifact, we encounter three figures in the vision, who some speculate might actually be Bane, Merkel, and Baal, and the entire cult of the Absolute might merely be a tool to ensure they reacquire true divinity. I would largely subscribe to this, but as always, the devil is in the details. I am much more interested in how the Dead Three seek to regain this power, and how they could possibly return to true godhood. What exactly will they do? And how is the player involved? The possibilities are tantalizing, given the pieces on the board: Githyanki artifacts, ancient Netherese magic, and the investment and interest of the Nine Hells. All these may or may not be involved, and all contribute to the mystery. Given Bane's historical stubbornness and ambition, we should all be wary should we encounter him in any form, even significantly reduced in power. He is almost certainly at the head of whatever complot is brewing. And I do intend to do separate profiles on Merkel and Baal respectively, so stay tuned for those. As always, thank you very much for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel, and I will check you out next time. Take care.